age. They trim the land, but truth don't vanish. It just waits to be free. Read the record slow and plain. Every line tells what they changed. Read the record, don't pretend. History speaks when you let it in. 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 When you let it in.
It's April 1877. In the State House of Columbia, South Carolina, federal soldiers were packing their gear up. For 12 years, these men had been the only thing standing between the newly elected Reconstruction government and the paramilitary groups who wanted them dead. There was no grand ceremony, just the sound of boots on the floorboards and the clatter of rifles being stacked. Outside the red shirts, we talked about them in, I want to say, episode 1 or episode 2. They were the armed wing of the Democratic Party. Yeah, you heard me right. The armed wing of the Democratic Party. Which, remember, back then, the Democratic Party was not the Democratic Party of today. The Democratic Party of today is more like the Republicans were back then. The Republican Party back then was the party of Abraham Lincoln. So, the red shirts were waiting. They weren't hiding anymore. They were watching the windows. They were timing the departure. And when the last soldier stepped into the street, literally everyone watching knew it was about to happen. Because, you see, the problem here is that the law hadn't changed. The protection had. This is Committed to Misunderstanding. I'm Chuck Lenahan, clinical mental health therapist, and your guide through the history that they decided you didn't need to know. History is the longest record of human behavior we have, and I'm going to read it correctly, because I have the receipts. 10 years after the Civil War ended, the United States made a quiet decision. After the war, the country passed 3 constitutional amendments that were supposed to fundamentally reboot the entire American system. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th Amendment established citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment protected the vote. On paper, the mission was accomplished. Full banner behind the president on the deck of a battle. Oh, sorry. Wrong mission accomplished. But the rights, they weren't just abstract ideas. In the South, Reconstruction governments were using this new legal power to build a society that never existed before. For the first time, Southern states were creating universal public education systems. They were building schools for children who just a few years earlier would have been barred from learning to read by law. We have states like Mississippi and South Carolina who weren't just building classrooms. They were creating state-funded mental health facilities, hospitals to open to both races. I mean, they were still going to be separate, but they were still open to both races. They were also restructuring the economy through state constitutional reforms. Reconstruction legislatures began taxing the landed property of the planter class to fund the schools and the hospitals. See, before the war, Southern tax systems were designed to protect the wealthy. And so they taxed the labor of the enslaved, not the actual land. Now the burden was shifting onto the people who had the most wealth and the most power. Black political participation, that wasn't just a symbolic victory. It was a structural overhaul. This was something that from before the founding of the United States of America, this is something that had never even entered the Southern vernacular. In South Carolina alone, over 600 Black men served in the state legislature or in local offices during this period of time. They were passing laws that protected sharecroppers from unfair contracts. They were expanding the rights of the poor, regardless of the race. But realistically, this new world only existed where it was physically defended. The former Confederate elite spent the decade running a campaign of constant violence to stop it. We saw this in the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. This is where black militia in South Carolina were surrounded by hundreds of armed white redshirts. Once the militia surrendered, 5 of the men were murdered in cold blood. The message was clear. No matter what the law said, the local power structure would use terror to restore the old order. You have to remember this threatened everybody in the South. This threatened the landholders. It threatened the old world money. It threatened the farmers. It threatened everybody. We no longer had in the South a free labor system. These people had to be paid. These people had to work, and were going to get money for it. Money that had never been paid to them before. They were immediately granted a class of citizenship where before they literally were property. The only reason that Reconstruction was surviving these attacks was the presence of the U.S. armed federal commanders, the U.S. armed services, the Army commanders. And these federal commanders, they had the power to remove local officials and hold military trials for insurgents. When President U.S. Grant used the Enforcement Acts in 1871 to suspend habeas corpus in South Carolina, he was proving that systemic terror could be stopped. But in order for it to be stopped, there had to be a constant physical commitment to enforcement. So you have to understand that by 1875, that commitment was fading. The North was tired of what was being called the Southern question. Simply put, that was, what do we do at the South? Do we continue to keep our federal agents there and ensure peace and tranquility, or do we just go ahead and let them manage their own affairs? Are they even grown up enough to eat at the adults table, or do they still need to sit at the kids table? And that was the question. The upcoming presidential election, well, that provided the perfect opportunity to walk away from the table. And when a country is looking for an excuse to walk away from its moral obligations, it's usually going to find one in the chaos of a contested presidential election. By the fall of 1876, the country was vibrating with a specific kind of dread. The Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was moderate. The Democrat, Samuel Tilden, promised reform, which was basically a code word for ending federal intervention in the South. The election was a bloodbath. In the Edgefield district of South Carolina, red shirts stood at the polls with rifles, openly threatening black voters. In Louisiana, the White League physically blocked roads to keep Republican canvassers from reaching rural precincts. When the votes were counted, Tilden won the popular vote, but the electoral count was stuck. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina each sent 2 competing sets of electors to Washington. Y'all, I'm going to say it again. You can't make this shit up. Let me say it for the folks in the back. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina each sent 2 competing sets of electors to Washington. Does that sound anywhere near familiar? January 6th, anyway. This created a constitutional vacuum. The 12th Amendment didn't say who decides which votes are valid when there are 2 sets. Did we ever fix that problem? Just curious. For the first time since 1861, people were openly talking about a second civil war. The situation was so dire that President Grant had to quietly strengthen the military defenses around Washington, D.C. Any of this sound familiar, y'all? To prevent a potential coup, an armed occupation of the Capitol ended up happening. To break the deadlock, Congress created the Electoral Commission of 1877. a 15-member body of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices. It was a desperate, extra-constitutional experiment. It was designed to be balanced, but a last-minute political shift in Illinois, led to the only independent member, Justice David Davis, resigning. He was replaced by Justice Joseph Bradley, a Republican. The commission voted 8-7 on every single disputed vote, awarding all 20 electors to Hayes. The Democrats in the House responded with a filibuster to prevent the count from being finished before Inauguration Day. They used every procedural trick in the book, from constant motions to adjourn to discovering errors in the paperwork. The Tilden or blood clubs, Tilden or blood clubs, were mobilizing, and the North was terrified that another war would destroy the recovering economy. In the weeks leading up to inauguration, the tension was so high that many congressmen carried revolvers on the floor of the House. There were genuine concerns that Tilden might be inaugurated by force in a separate ceremony, splitting the government in two. Can't make this shit up, y'all. We don't learn from our mistakes. We don't learn. The pressure to reach a settlement, any settlement that avoided a fight between white men, became the only priority in D.C. So while the politicians in Washington were debating the fine print of the Constitution, the people whose lives depended on that protection were watching the gears of the system grind to a halt. So to see what this pressure felt like for the people on the ground, we need to look at a man named Robert Smalls. Smalls was a hero who famously hijacked a Confederate steamship and delivered it to the Union. By 1876, he was a U.S. congressman representing South Carolina. He had spent the decade building schools and defending the right of his constituents to own land. During the disputed election, Smalls was nearly killed by a white mob while trying to board a train. He saw his supporters being dragged from their homes. He knew that as long as the federal government stayed engaged, his people had a future. Smalls wasn't just a political figure. He was a symbol of what the New South could be. He fought to ensure that public schools that he helped fund were open to both black and white children. He believed in a system where law was the ultimate equalizer. But as the negotiations dragged on in Washington, Smalls could tell. He could feel the shift. He was one of the men that South Carolina State House. He was one of the men in the South Carolina State House who were watching the soldiers pack their bags. He understood that his seat in Congress and the safety of every black family in his district was being traded for peace, quote unquote. That didn't include them. Smalls would eventually be convicted of a trumped up bribery charge as part of the Redeemer effort to discredit black leaders. That he was later pardoned by the same governor who used the red shirts to take power to begin with. But when the soldiers left, Smalls was effectively left in a room with the men who had just tried to assassinate him. Smalls's stories is a reminder that when the system decides to compromise, it isn't just trading votes; it's trading people. And the compromise of 1877 was the blueprint for that trade. So this is the mechanism that ends Reconstruction. In late February 1877, the presidency of the United States was effectively settled through these series of intense political negotiations. Some of the final and most famous discussions took place at the Warmly Hotel in Washington. Historians have come to view this compromise not as a single signed contract, but as a broader political convergence. The South held leverage. They could stop the government from functioning. In exchange for allowing Hayes to take the presidency, the federal government agreed to home rule. In practice, this meant the withdrawal of the remaining federal troops. Hayes did not repeal the 14th Amendment. He did not ask Congress to strike down the enforcement acts. He just withdrew the enforcement power. He ordered the soldiers in Columbia and New Orleans to return to their barracks. A right is not a physical object. It's a social promise that can only exist if there's a mechanism to enforce it. So by withdrawing the troops, Hayes basically unplugged the 14th Amendment. The law remained on the books, but the government signaled it would no longer protect anyone trying to use it. So once the soldiers were gone, home rule became a legal vacuum where redeemers were free to restructure society of the South. The guardrails had come off. The guards were removed. The lights were turned off. And so the work of rebuilding the old hierarchy, well, that began in earnest. But this time they were going to make sure they didn't get it wrong. This time, they built it into the law itself. And, who could have predicted? But the collapse was immediate. As soon as federal oversight vanished, the Redeemer legislators began a process of legal extraction. They started by dismantling the constitutional protections through the courts. Again, does this sound familiar to anybody? I mean, I don't know where the current administration got its playbook. I knew who they got it from, but I'm not sure, who he got it from. But in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled in the United States v. Cruikshank that the Colfax massacre, where over 100 black men were murdered by a white militia, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment didn't give the federal government the power to prosecute individuals for violating the rights of others. Only state could do that. Only the state courts could do that. Let me say that again for the people in the back. The Colfax massacre happened, and 100 black men were murdered by a white militia. And come on, we're talking the 1800s, post-Civil War, during Reconstruction. That this wasn't going to be the first time that stuff like this happened. To this degree, it was a pretty big deal, though. But the Supreme Court said it doesn't matter that this happened. There is no legal avenue for the federal government to prosecute individuals for violating the rights of others. Only the state courts could do that. Well, since the state was the one controlled by the militia, the law became a closed loop. The victims' rights weren't erased; they were just made impossible to defend. And following Cruikshank, the court struck again in 1883 with the civil rights cases. They ruled that the 14th Amendment only prohibited state discrimination, not private discrimination. This effectively handed the keys to every railroad, hotel, and restaurant in the South to the segregators. It was the birth of private world where the Constitution supposedly didn't apply. We still see this now. We saw it in the case where the Supreme Court said that there was no reason why the bakery could choose not to have a gay client. That's where this came from. By 1890, Mississippi took all of this a step further. They held a new constitutional convention specifically designed to, quote, exclude the Negro, unquote. They didn't use the word race because that would violate the 15th Amendment. Instead, they did what Southern states were going to do. They used poll taxes, property requirements. literacy tests administered by white registrars who could ask a black voter to interpret a complex section of the state constitution on the spot. Probably worthy to note that the white people, had they been asked to do the same thing, they would not have been able to either. And so they turned the right to vote into a luxury that the state could withhold at will. In 1892, Mississippi had 147,000 black men of voting age. Only 8,615 were actually registered to vote. 8,615 out of 147,000. But the most devastating turn was the weaponization of criminal law. Without federal troops to protect against wrongful arrest, southern states passed vagrancy laws. In Alabama, it became a crime for a black man to be unemployed. If you heard that. If you were white, it was okay. If you were arrested, you were fined. If you couldn't pay, then the state would lease you and your labor to private coal mines or turpentine farms. It was a structural evolution of slavery. The courthouse replaced the auction block. In 1878, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act. This law, it restricted the use of military for domestic law enforcement. Did you guys catch that? The 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, restricted the use of military for domestic law enforcement. That's why in places like Minneapolis, Chicago, wherever, that's why federal soldiers are not used to do anything other than protect, or not supposed to be used to protect anything other than federal buildings from being looted or ransacked or whatever. They're not there for law enforcement. Now, how do we get around this with ICE? Well, it's easy, because the ICE isn't military. Paramilitary, maybe, but they're not military. They're law enforcement. And so while it wasn't the only reason that the federal intervention stopped, it did serve as a powerful legal shield. It made future federal intervention much more difficult and reinforced the broader withdrawal of enforcement. It ensured that the Redeemer governments could run their extraction systems without a fear of a federal soldier ever stepping foot into a local courthouse again. And this wasn't just a political shift. This was a psychological one. To make this system work, the entire nation had to look at what was happening and find a way to call it something else. Let me say that again for the people in the back. To make this system work, the entire nation had to look at what was happening and find a way to call it something else. When we look at 1877 from a behavioral perspective, we see what happens when people become so exhausted by conflict that they decide peace matters more than justice. As a therapist, I see this in families where one member is being abused. The rest of the family eventually reaches a point of conflict fatigue. They don't necessarily support the abuse, but they're so tired of the tension that they begin to resent the victim for causing the drama. They want to return to normalcy, even if that normalcy is a lie. In the 1870s, the North was exhausted. To justify walking away, they had to reconstruct their own national identity. They began to reframe the Civil War not as a struggle over human rights, but as a tragic misunderstanding between honorable opponents. This is what happens when a society needs to soothe its own guilt. They had to make the victims of their own abandonment look unworthy of protection. They started writing stories about corruption of Reconstruction governments. They rebranded betrayal as reconciliation. The North got their railroads and economic expansion. The South got their controlled labor. They protected their identity as good people by deciding the problem was solved. They decided it was solved the moment that they stopped looking at it. As long as we close our eyes, hold our noses, and turn away, it doesn't exist. It's something akin to rebranding the people who were part of the January 6th insurrection as heroes. You know, we like to think that these patterns of behavior belong to the 19th century, but when we look at how we treat enforcement today, the parallels are impossible to ignore. You see them, and when you don't see them, I point them out to you. You know, and if you choose not to see them after that, well, then you enjoy watching the shit, because your head's up your own ass. You know, we see this mechanism, the removal of oversight in our modern legal landscape. Take the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It worked because it had an enforcement mechanism called preclearance. Under Section 5, any state with a history of discrimination had to pre-clear any change to their voting laws to the federal government. The oversight was incredibly effective. It meant that if a county tried to move a polling place to an inaccessible location, or a state tried to redraw a map to dilute the black vote, the federal government could simply say no before the damage was done. It wasn't just a law; it was a real-time monitor. It prevented thousands of discriminatory changes from ever taking effect. From 1982 to 2006, the DOJ blocked 700 proposed voting changes that were deemed discriminatory. But in 2013, in Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court removed that mechanism. They didn't strike down the right to vote. They just struck down the power to oversee it. Chief Justice Roberts, he argued that our country has changed and that oversight was an unfair burden on the states. Same Chief Justice Roberts that is still Chief Justice Roberts, by the way. It's the exact same logic that we used in 1877. Within 24 hours of that decision, states like Texas began implementing restrictive voting laws that had previously been blocked under Section 5. You don't believe me? What just happened in Dallas literally 3 days ago? We don't learn from history, y'all. We don't learn from history because this is the shit that nobody talks about. This is the shit that we allow to happen because we want to stay ignorant. Why? Since then, we've seen, a wave of polling place closures in minority neighborhoods, new hurdles to registration, and again, look at Dallas, Texas, literally 3 days ago. When the enforcement mechanism is removed, the system doesn't stay fair. It reverts to the interests of whoever holds the local power. Rights they're not self-sustaining. They require an active presence of enforcement. Chief Justice Roberts' Supreme Court took that enforcement away. History shows us that once the overseer leaves the building, the old habits of power don't wait long to return. We saw it then. We see it now. We ignored it then. We're ignoring it now. We can't afford to ignore history over and over and over again, because we will see the demise of the American way of life. We will see the demise of the United States. It's coming if we don't learn, y'all. You heard it here, not first, but you heard it here. It's important to realize that Reconstruction didn't fail because the amendments were weak. It failed because the country decided we were finished enforcing them. A right is only as real as the person willing to stand between you and the person who wants to take it away. When we decide that standing there is too expensive or too divisive, we're deciding who we're willing to lose. I want to look back a little bit on the answer to the Southern question. In order to do that, we really have to look at the bill that eventually came due. When a group of people or a whole nation decides to maintain a false peace by ignoring the abuser, the trauma doesn't vanish. It goes underground and it mutates. Okay. By 1877, the white North and the white South had achieved a reconciliation. But it was reconciliation based on a debt that Black Americans would be forced to pay for the next century, and probably longer than that. You know, we see this in the sudden silence that fell over the federal government. From 1877 until the 1950s, Congress basically stopped talking about civil rights. They treated the 14th and 15th Amendments like embarrassing relics of a radical era that they had outgrown. The silence wasn't just absence of speech. It was deliberate policy on non-interference. And that meant that if a Black veteran was lynched in his uniform on a courthouse lawn, the Department of Justice would claim that they lacked the jurisdiction to investigate. These weren't just crimes. They were public rituals of enforcement. They happened because the federal government had signaled that it would no longer intervene in local matters. The peace that Hayes and Tilden negotiated wasn't a peace at all. It was a ceasefire between white power structures that required the violent suppression of Black progress in order to stay in effect. We're still in 2026. We're still trying to pay down the interest on that moral debt every time we argue about whether the federal government has a right to oversee local police or local polls. This didn't end in the 1800s. This hasn't even ended yet. And if we don't take the whitewash history and bring it back to the Technicolor reality and learn from our fucking mistakes, I don't see where this ends anytime soon. We have to understand that the extraction wasn't physical or just legal. It was narrative. In order to keep that 1877 agreement standing, the country had to commit a massive rewrite of history. Does any of this fucking sound familiar? We see this most clearly in the Gettysburg Reunion of 1913. 50 years after the battle, thousands of aging Union and Confederate veterans met on that field. They shook hands over the stone walls. They talked about valor and shared sacrifice. But there's a glaring detail in the receipts of that event. The clause of the war was never mentioned. Slavery was not mentioned. The 180,000 Black soldiers, 180,000 Black soldiers who fought for the Union were not invited. Let that sit with y'all for a second. 180,000 Northern Black soldiers who fought for their rights, their personhood, alongside their white brethren, were not invited to the reunion at Gettysburg. This was narrative extraction in its purest form. To make the 1877 compromise feel virtuous, the war had to be reframed as a brother's quarrel, where both sides were equally right. This is where the landscape itself was rewritten. This is where the era when the majority of Confederate monuments were built not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but decades later, during the height of the Jim Crow era. They weren't built as gravestones. They were built as boundary markers. There were physical receipts of the 1877 deal that signaled to everyone walking by that the federal government was gone and the old hierarchy was back in stone. Was back in stone. When you spend 80 years teaching a nation that its most democratic era was actually its most shameful, you create a deep systemic confusion. You make people suspicious of the very mechanisms of federal protection. You make states' rights sound like a principle of liberty rather than what it was in 1877, a permit for dispossession. We're living in the wreckage of that narrative now. We're trying to remember a history that our ancestors were paid to forget so that they could sleep at night. Y'all, Reconstruction didn't fail because the amendments were weak. It failed because our country decided it was finished enforcing them. The number of places where I can tell you right now that this same thing exists, I don't have time for in one podcast. That's what the whole series is for. That's what the whole purpose of this podcast is for. As of this recording, I have 15 followers on YouTube, and I think 6 on Spotify and none on Apple Podcasts, and that's fine. I'm not doing this for the follows, the likes, the subscribes. I'm doing this because as a white man, I've realized we're fucked if we don't fix this. How many more times can we go through the bullshit of closing our eyes, turning our backs on not just people, not just citizens, not even just immigrants, but all classes? How can we, as a nation, claim to be what we say we are, what the Statue of Liberty has inscribed on the book in her hands, if we don't learn from this? We keep repeating it, y'all. We call it different things as the decades go on, but we keep repeating the same fucking mistakes. And then we're surprised every time that it happens. Because we need to realize that a right is only as real as the person willing to stand between you and the person who wants to take it away. Speaking as a white man, I'm going to tell you right now, we don't do a good job of this. We don't protect the people who we need to protect. We have the power. We have inherent power. And if this episode taught you nothing, we've had inherent power since the Civil War, which means we've had inherent power since before this country even existed as a country. And what do we choose to do with it? Nothing. Because when we decide that standing there is too expensive or too divisive, we are deciding who we're willing to lose. Whitewash history brought back to its technical reality. This is what it actually looks like. History is the longest record of human behavior that we have. I'm going to keep reading it correctly because I have the receipts. The mechanism changes, the spine does not. And next episode, we're moving into extraction. We're going to look at convict leasing. How the legal vacuum of 1877 was filled with a system of slavery by another name, turning the courthouse into a labor brokerage for the industrialized South. And I'm going to have a legal expert on to help me with this. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you think that that doesn't still exist, bullshit. It most certainly does. Erasure, extraction, enforcement, narrative, and responsibility. We are building the case.
Clean the language. They trim the land. But truth don't vanish. It just waits to be free. Read the record slow and plain. Every line tells what they changed. Read the record, don't pretend. History speaks when you let it